The Hells Angels biker watched the little girl retrieve a rusted lockbox from river mud, and the secret inside recut his fate. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. As Jake stared at the rusted lockbox in the little girl's hands, the weight of the moment hit him hard. His rough hands, usually steady and sure, now trembled slightly as he watched her carefully examining the box. The symbols carved into its surface seemed almost familiar, like a lost language he had once known, a language from a past that he had tried to bury long ago. Jake knew this wasn't just any ordinary lockbox. This was something more. The girl's small fingers turned the box in her hands, her eyes wide with curiosity and confusion. She was too young to understand the significance, but Jake was starting to realize that what she held in her hands could change everything. "Do you want to open it?" Jake asked, his voice quieter than usual, the question hanging in the air between them. The girl nodded slowly, looking up at him with an expression that mixed hope and uncertainty. He could tell she didn't know what was inside, but she was determined to find out. Jake squatted down beside her, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. He glanced at the lockbox again, his mind racing. This wasn't just a coincidence. The symbols, the box, the way it felt. Everything screamed that this moment was connected to something much bigger than a random discovery. As the girl attempted to open the box, her hands shaking with a mix of excitement and fear, Jake took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He couldn't help but wonder if this box had been waiting for him. He had lived his life by the rules of the road, avoiding any ties, any attachments. But now, in the presence of this little girl and the mysterious box, everything was about to change. The girl struggled with the lock, her tiny hands trying to twist it open. Jake placed a hand on hers, his touch gentle despite his rough exterior. "Let me help," he said, his voice softening. With a quick flick of his fingers, the lock clicked open. The girl's eyes widened in shock, and she slowly lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in the faded velvet lining, was a single photograph, yellowed with age, and a small, silver key. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the photograph. It was a picture of a man he didn't recognize, but there was something about the man's face that struck him, something familiar. The key inside the box seemed to glow faintly, its intricate design almost hypnotic. The girl stared at the contents, still unsure of what she had found. "What is it?" she asked, her voice small. Jake didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. The photograph, the key, the feeling that something important had just been uncovered. This was no accident. This box had been waiting for someone to find it, and that someone, it seemed, was Jake. He stood up, holding the photograph in his hands. "I don't know," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. "But I think it's time I find out." The girl looked up at him, her innocent gaze filled with trust. Jake knew he couldn't walk away from this. He had spent too long running from his past, but now, it seemed, his past had caught up with him. He had no choice but to face it head on. As Jake tucked the photograph into his jacket pocket, he turned to the girl. "We need to find out where this key leads," he said. "And we need to do it fast." The girl nodded, still unsure of what was happening, but following his lead. Together, they walked along the riverbank, the weight of the moment pressing down on Jake's chest. He could feel the tension in the air, like a storm was about to break. And yet, despite the uncertainty, there was a strange sense of purpose building inside him. This wasn't just about the box. This was about redemption. This was about finding answers to the questions that had haunted him for so long. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, more to himself than to the girl. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." As they walked, Jake's mind was consumed with thoughts of the past, the decisions he had made, the people he had lost, the secrets he had buried deep within. But with the girl by his side and the lockbox in his hand, Jake felt something stirring inside him. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. The evening air was thick with tension as Jake and the girl made their way through the dense forest, the rusted lockbox clutched tightly in his hands. The photograph and the small, intricate key inside the box felt heavier with each step. The weight of the past, something he had tried so hard to forget, was beginning to resurface. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life had led him to this very moment, to this tiny girl who had unknowingly opened a door to a past he could no longer ignore. The girl, still walking beside him, glanced up at him with a mix of curiosity and trust. She had no idea what was at stake, but she was following him, her small hand clutching the edge of his jacket as if she understood, even if she couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence between them. Jake looked down at her, seeing the innocence in her eyes. He wasn't sure how to answer her, not yet. He hadn't even figured it out for himself. "We're going to find out what this key opens," he replied softly. "And when we do, everything's going to change." The girl didn't say anything more, but she nodded, her tiny steps quickening to match his pace. They walked for what felt like hours, the quiet rustling of the leaves and the distant sound of the river the only sounds that accompanied them. The air grew colder as the night deepened, and Jake could feel the chill creeping through his jacket, but it wasn't the cold that had his mind racing. It was the key, the photograph, the memories that were slowly flooding back, memories he had buried deep in his heart, far from the man he had become. He had once been a different person, someone full of hope, of dreams for the future. But that person had disappeared long ago, replaced by the hardened biker who wore the Hells Angels patch like a shield. As they neared an old, abandoned barn, Jake stopped. He had seen this place before. It was a familiar landmark, one he had passed by countless times but never stopped at. Tonight, it felt different. The barn was falling apart, the wooden beams weathered and cracked with age. It had once been a farm, a place of life and warmth, but now it stood as a relic of the past, much like Jake himself. "This is it," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Is this where the key goes?" she asked. Jake didn't answer her immediately. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the silver key. It felt cold against his skin, like it had a life of its own. Slowly, he moved toward the barn, the girl following closely behind him. The barn door creaked as Jake pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, the air was musty, the scent of old hay and rusted tools hanging in the air. It was dark, save for the dim light from the moon filtering through the cracks in the walls. Jake's heart raced as he stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. The girl hesitated for a moment before stepping inside with him. He could feel her eyes on him, waiting for him to make the next move. The barn was eerily silent, the only sound the steady thumping of his heartbeat. He walked toward the far corner, where a large, dusty chest sat. It was old, covered in cobwebs, its lock almost identical to the one on the box they had found by the river. Jake's hands shook as he approached it. He had been here before, years ago, but at that time, he hadn't known what it meant. Now he did. He inserted the key into the lock, his breath catching in his throat. It turned easily, the sound of the mechanism clicking loudly in the quiet barn. As the lid creaked open, Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. Inside the chest was a collection of old papers, faded and yellowed with age, along with a leather-bound journal. The journal was worn, its cover cracked and frayed, but it was unmistakably familiar. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for it, his fingers brushing over the cover. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. The journal contained the answers to everything, the truth he had spent years avoiding, the truth that had haunted him, the truth about the people he had lost, the mistakes he had made, and the ties that had been severed long ago. As Jake opened the journal, the first page revealed a name, one he hadn't seen in over a decade. It was his own. His heart skipped a beat as he read the words on the page. It was a letter written to him by someone he had trusted, someone he thought he had left behind. The letter explained everything, the secret, the betrayal, the reason for his exile from the life he once knew. It was a life he had tried so hard to forget. And now, with the journal in his hands, Jake knew that he couldn't run anymore. The past was no longer something he could leave behind. It was something he had to face. As the girl looked up at him, her innocent eyes full of questions, Jake closed the journal and tucked it under his arm. "We need to go," he said, his voice firm. "We're not done yet." The girl looked at him, her expression confused but trusting. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew Jake had a plan. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had a purpose again. The night had settled over the barn like a heavy blanket, the faint light from the moon casting shadows over the wooden beams. Jake stood frozen, the journal tucked firmly under his arm, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The girl, still by his side, seemed unaware of the storm of emotions raging inside him. She was looking at the chest, her innocent gaze filled with wonder, still unsure of the gravity of the situation. Jake had always prided himself on his ability to control his emotions, to keep his cool, no matter what life threw at him. But now, standing in the middle of this forgotten barn, everything was unraveling. The journal he held in his hands was the key to everything. The key to the past he had tried so desperately to escape. But now, with the girl beside him, Jake was beginning to realize that there was no escaping it. He had to confront it head-on. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice low but firm. He was doing everything he could to keep his composure, but the past was coming for him, and there was no stopping it. The girl looked up at him, confusion written across her face. "Leave? But where are we going?" she asked, her small voice carrying the innocence of youth. Jake sighed and shook his head. "We're going to find the truth," he said, his words heavy with meaning. "And we're going to make sure it stays buried where it belongs." The girl nodded, still not fully understanding, but trusting him without question. Together, they made their way out of the barn, Jake's mind racing. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. The journal had revealed so much, yet so much was still hidden. The letter inside, the one addressed to him, had spoken of betrayal, of dark secrets from a time long ago. But the question remained, who had written it? Who had been involved? And most importantly, what was the secret that had been buried all these years? Jake wasn't sure he was ready to face the answers, but there was no turning back now. As they walked through the dark, their footsteps echoed in the stillness, a constant reminder that time was running out. He needed to find the answers before it was too late. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. The truth would come out, whether he was ready for it or not. "Do you think we're safe?" the girl asked, breaking the silence once again. Her voice was soft, filled with a child's innocent worry. Jake stopped in his tracks, looking down at her. "No," he said simply. "We're never safe. Not really. But we have to keep moving." He turned and began walking again, the girl following him closely. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken truth that neither of them could ignore. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As they reached the edge of the forest, Jake paused and looked around. The trees stood like sentinels in the night, their shadows stretching long across the ground. He knew the area well, but tonight it felt different. It felt like they were being watched. His instincts, honed over years of living on the edge, told him they weren't alone. A rustling sound from the underbrush caught his attention, and he spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. But there was nothing there, just the wind moving through the trees. "What's wrong?" the girl asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake didn't answer immediately. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The feeling of being watched was getting stronger, but he couldn't see anything out of place. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the darkness. The girl, sensing the change in his demeanor, stepped closer to him, her small hand gripping the sleeve of his jacket. Together, they moved forward, the tension in the air palpable. Jake's heart was racing, every instinct telling him that something was wrong. But what was it? Who was out there? The feeling of being watched lingered, growing stronger with every step they took. The silence of the forest felt like it was closing in on them. Then, from the darkness ahead, a figure stepped into view. Jake froze, his eyes narrowing as he studied the figure. The silhouette was tall, its features obscured by the shadows, but there was something familiar about the way it moved. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. The figure didn't respond immediately, but after a moment, it took a step closer. And then, Jake saw the patch. The unmistakable mark of the Hell's Angels. Jake's stomach churned. "What do you want?" he asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The figure stepped forward into the light, revealing a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of Jake's past. The man's face was scarred, his eyes cold and calculating. He looked at Jake for a long moment before speaking. "I'm here for the journal." the man said, his voice low and gravelly. You don't know what you found, but I do. Jake's mind raced. The journal, the key, the lockbox. It was all connected. And now, it seemed, the past had come back to collect its due. The man's cold eyes met Jake's with an unsettling calmness. His scarred face barely registered any emotion, but there was something about him that Jake couldn't shake, a familiarity he couldn't place. The moment stretched between them, like a taut wire, ready to snap. The girl beside Jake shifted nervously, sensing the tension, but she didn't say anything. She clung to his jacket, her small hand wrapped around the fabric as though it were the only thing keeping her safe. Jake's instincts kicked in. He knew this man wasn't here to chat. What do you want with the journal? Jake asked, his voice low, every muscle in his body coiled, ready to spring into action. The man chuckled darkly, the sound of it sending a chill down Jake's spine. You don't even know what you're holding, do you? The man took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Jake. That journal isn't just some old storybook. It's the key to a fortune, a secret that's been buried for years. And now it's yours. Jake's grip tightened around the journal tucked under his arm. His mind raced. The words hit him harder than he expected. Fortune. Secret. Buried for years. This wasn't just a matter of personal history. It was much bigger than that. You're full of shit, Jake spat, stepping forward. He could feel the girl's eyes on him, but he couldn't afford to show any weakness. Not now. The man didn't flinch. He just smiled, a twisted smirk that seemed to know something Jake didn't. You still don't get it, do you? The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He held it up between them, letting it dangle for a moment before he tossed it to the ground in front of Jake. Open it, the man demanded. Jake stared at the envelope, his eyes narrowing. His gut twisted with unease. He didn't need to open it to know this wasn't just a warning. This was a message. Reluctantly, he crouched down and picked it up, his fingers brushing the old paper. The girl beside him watched with wide eyes. What's in there? She asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer. He opened the envelope slowly, as if the act itself might trigger something he wasn't prepared for. Inside, there was a single photograph, much like the one from the lockbox, but this one was different. This one had a face, a familiar face. His own. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the image. The picture showed him, younger, standing in front of a house that seemed to flicker in his memory like a fading dream. It was a place he hadn't thought about in years, a place he had left behind when everything fell apart. The photograph was old, but not as old as the others. It was from a time when he was still part of something he thought he had outgrown. Something he'd thought was buried. What is this? Jake asked, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. The man smiled again, a cold, cruel smile that sent shivers down Jake's spine. That's the place where it all started. And now you're going back to it. Whether you like it or not. Jake's mind was racing. The house, the picture, it was all connected to the journal. The past, his past, was coming back for him, and he couldn't escape it. Not anymore. He looked up at the man, his grip tightening on the journal. I don't know who you are, Jake said, his voice calm, but the fury building inside him was palpable. But I'm not giving you this journal. The man's expression didn't change. He stepped back, his eyes still locked on Jake. You'll give it to me, he said quietly, or you'll wish you had. Jake felt a flicker of fear, but he pushed it down, replacing it with the anger and resolve that had served him well all these years. You think I'm afraid of you? Jake asked. You don't know who you're dealing with. The man didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. For a moment, Jake stood frozen, watching the darkness where the man had vanished. He could feel the girl's gaze on him, her small hand still gripping his jacket. Are we safe? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake exhaled slowly, his mind still spinning. He didn't know. He didn't know if they were safe, if they ever would be again. But he couldn't let her see his doubt. For now, Jake said, his voice steady. But we need to get moving. He turned away from the spot where the man had stood, the journal still clutched tightly under his arm. The past was closing in, and there was nowhere to run. Not anymore. We're going to find out the truth, Jake said, more to himself than to the girl. And we're going to make sure they can't take it from us. The girl, still holding on to him, nodded silently. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew one thing. She trusted Jake. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. The journey continued through the night, the air thick with the unspoken tension that seemed to hang between Jake and the girl. The weight of the journal under his arm felt like it was growing heavier with every step. The photograph, the house, the past, it was all coming to a head, and Jake knew that there was no turning back. He didn't say much as they walked, his mind racing. Every so often, the girl would look up at him, her small hand still gripping his sleeve, sensing that something was off. But she didn't ask any questions. She just followed. Jake didn't know where they were headed, but he felt the pull of something larger than himself. The man from earlier had made it clear that the journal was more than just a personal relic. It was part of something much bigger, something dangerous. As they walked through the dense trees, the path starting to wind through the wilderness, Jake's instincts were on high alert. The feeling of being watched hadn't left him. If anything, it had grown stronger. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as every sound seemed amplified in the quiet night. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. But there was one sound that stood out above the rest, the sound of footsteps, following them, just out of sight. Jake stopped dead in his tracks, his body tense, his eyes scanning the dark shadows between the trees. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The girl looked up at him, wide-eyed and scared. "I think we're being followed," Jake continued, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. The girl's grip on his sleeve tightened. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what they could do. They were deep in the forest now, far from any kind of help. But he wasn't going to let anyone get to them. Not now. Not after everything they had already been through. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice low but firm. He started walking again, quicker this time, his eyes scanning the shadows, every sense on high alert. The footsteps behind them grew louder, closer. They were being hunted. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed forward, but the girl was beginning to fall behind. "Come on," Jake urged, turning to look at her. She was scared, but she was still trying to keep up, her small legs struggling to match his pace. He reached out and took her hand, pulling her along as they continued their hurried journey. The footsteps behind them didn't stop. If anything, they were gaining speed. Whoever was following them was determined. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew they needed to find somewhere to hide. But where? The trees seemed to stretch on forever, offering little in the way of cover. They couldn't outrun whoever was trailing them. They had to outsmart them. As they reached a clearing, Jake glanced around quickly, his mind racing. There, a large boulder, half covered by a tangle of vines. It was the perfect place to hide. Jake pulled the girl toward it, pushing her behind the rock. He crouched down beside her, peering through the leaves and branches. He could hear the footsteps now, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the soft rustling of branches. The person following them was close. Too close. "Don't make a sound," Jake whispered to the girl, his voice a mere breath. She nodded silently, her wide eyes filled with fear, but also trust. They waited, holding their breath, as the figure drew closer. Jake's mind was working overtime. Whoever was out there knew something. They knew about the journal, about the lockbox, about the secrets Jake had been running from. And they weren't going to stop until they had it. The figure was almost on top of them now, but just as Jake tensed, ready to move, the footsteps suddenly stopped. A rustling sound came from behind them, followed by a voice, familiar, yet foreign. "You can't run from this forever, Morrison," the voice said, low and dangerous. Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was him, the man from the barn, the one who had tossed the photograph in front of him, the one who had hinted at the secrets buried in his past. He was here. Jake slowly turned his head, his grip on the knife tightening. He wasn't going to let this man take the journal. He wasn't going to let him take anything. The girl's eyes flicked up to him, sensing the change in his posture. "Jake?" she whispered. He didn't answer her. He didn't need to. She knew. The man stepped into the clearing, his silhouette outlined by the pale light of the moon. He stood there for a moment, his cold eyes scanning the shadows, before locking onto Jake. "You're not getting away this time," the man said, his voice like gravel. Jake felt his blood run cold, but he didn't flinch. "You've been following us," Jake said, his voice steady, though the tension in his muscles was palpable. "Why?" The man didn't answer right away. He just stepped forward, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "Because you've got something that belongs to me," the man said, his hand slowly reaching for something at his belt. Jake's pulse quickened. He didn't know what the man was carrying, but he wasn't about to find out. You'll have to take it from me, Jake said, his voice colder now, his knife ready. We're not going anywhere with you. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. We'll see about that, he muttered, stepping closer. The man took another step closer, his boots crunching softly on the dry leaves. Jake's grip on his knife tightened, his every muscle coiled in anticipation. The girl, now behind the boulder, watched silently, her wide eyes filled with fear, but also an unspoken trust in Jake. He couldn't let her see him falter. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. You think you can threaten me and get away with it? Jake said, his voice steady but laced with anger. The man just smirked, the expression twisted with a knowing look. I don't think you understand. This isn't just about the journal. This is about something much bigger than you, much bigger than any of us. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known there was something more at stake than just an old journal, but he hadn't fully realized how deep this went. You're involved in something dangerous, the man continued, taking another step forward, his hand still slowly moving towards his belt. And you're not the only one who knows about it. Jake's mind raced. Who else knew? Who else was after the same thing? The journal, the lockbox. It wasn't just a coincidence that he had found it. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle. And now, this man, this stranger, was making it clear that he was part of the puzzle too. I'm not interested in playing your games, Jake said, trying to keep his voice even, though the anxiety was building up inside him. The man's grin widened. You don't have a choice, he replied, his voice cold. You think you can walk away from this, but you can't. We both know that. Jake's grip on the knife tightened, but he didn't move. Not yet. He needed more information. The man stopped just a few feet away, looking down at Jake with an air of superiority. You know what's in the journal, don't you? He asked, almost mockingly. Jake's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't give the man the satisfaction of answering. He had to keep his cards close. You'll never understand it. You're too far gone, the man said with a shake of his head. But I can help you. We can work together. You don't have to do this alone. The offer hung in the air like a weight. Jake knew the man was trying to manipulate him, to get inside his head. But Jake had learned long ago that help from people like him came at a steep price. I don't trust you, Jake said, his voice hard. I never will. The man's smile faltered for just a second, before he quickly regained his composure. He straightened up, and for the first time, Jake saw a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. Then you'll regret it, the man said, his voice low and threatening. I'm not the one you need to worry about. It's the ones above me, and they'll stop at nothing to get what's theirs. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating the space between them. Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of the man's cryptic warning. Who was he working for? And why was the journal so important to these people? You don't scare me, Jake said, his voice steady, though his mind was already making plans. The man's expression turned cold, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous intensity. Without warning, he lunged forward, his hand reaching for something hidden in his jacket. Jake's instincts kicked in immediately. He stepped back, swinging the knife up to block the man's strike. The man's hand collided with the blade, a sharp, metallic sound echoing in the night. You should have listened, the man sneered, his hand now bleeding. But he didn't seem to care. He stepped back, wiping the blood off his palm with a look of disdain. Jake knew he had to act fast. The man was dangerous, but Jake wasn't going to let him take control of the situation. With one swift movement, Jake ducked low and drove the knife into the ground beside the man's feet, sending a cloud of dirt and leaves into the air. The man staggered back, momentarily disoriented. Jake took advantage of the momentary confusion, grabbing the girl by the hand and pulling her behind him. Run, Jake hissed, his voice urgent. The girl didn't hesitate. She followed Jake as he sprinted through the trees, the sound of the man's voice fading behind them. You can't escape, the man called after them. But Jake wasn't stopping. Not now. Not when everything was at stake. They ran through the forest, the moonlight barely cutting through the thick canopy above. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, his breaths ragged, but he didn't dare slow down. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. They had to find a way out of this. The girl's footsteps echoed behind him, steady and quick. She was keeping up, despite the fear in her eyes. "Where are we going?" she asked, breathless from the run. Jake didn't answer immediately. His mind was working overtime, calculating their next move. They needed to find shelter. They needed to figure out what the man had meant about the ones above him. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. "Just keep running," Jake said finally, glancing back over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. "We'll figure it out." The forest stretched on ahead of them, dark and endless. Jake knew they couldn't outrun their past forever, but for now, it was all they had. They ran through the thick underbrush, their footsteps heavy in the silence of the forest. Jake could feel the weight of the journal in his jacket, its presence a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The girl, breathless and scared, struggled to keep up, but she was determined. She trusted Jake, and he wasn't going to let her down. "We need to find shelter," Jake said, his voice tight. "We can't stay out here much longer." The girl nodded, though she was still too frightened to speak. Her small hand gripped his tightly, and Jake could feel the warmth of her tiny fingers. It was a small comfort in the middle of all the chaos. The night seemed endless, the trees stretching out around them like dark, looming giants. Jake's mind raced. They couldn't outrun the past forever, and the man who had been following them was just the beginning. Whoever was after them wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Jake's muscles ached from the run, but he pushed forward, knowing they couldn't afford to slow down. Finally, they came upon a small cabin, nestled at the edge of a clearing. It looked abandoned, the wooden structure weathered and old, but it was the best option they had. Jake glanced over his shoulder one last time, scanning the shadows for any signs of pursuit. When he didn't see anyone, he pulled the girl toward the cabin. They slipped inside, the door creaking as it opened. The interior was dark and musty, but it would have to do. Jake took a quick survey of the room. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a faint glow over the space. There was a small table in the corner, along with a few old chairs and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, but it was quiet, and that was all that mattered right now. "Stay here," Jake said, motioning for the girl to sit at the table. He didn't know if they were safe, but they needed to catch their breath, to regroup. He walked over to the window and peered through the dusty glass, his eyes scanning the clearing outside. The forest was still and quiet, but Jake knew better than to think they were safe. He could feel the weight of the journal pressing against his chest, and the secrets inside it were starting to feel like a ticking time bomb. What had he gotten himself into? He had thought he was just following a trail of forgotten memories, but now it was clear that there was more at stake. Whoever was after him wasn't just interested in the journal. They wanted something far more dangerous. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind him. "Are we safe here?" The girl's voice was small, uncertain. Jake turned to face her, forcing a reassuring smile. "For now," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He walked over to the table and sat down across from her, trying to shake the exhaustion from his limbs. The girl was still clutching his jacket sleeve, her eyes wide with fear. He could see the questions in her gaze, but she didn't ask. She didn't need to. She trusted him to protect her. "You're doing good," Jake said, his voice soft. "We'll figure this out." The girl nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't know what he was up against, didn't know the full weight of the situation. But he couldn't tell her. Not yet. He had to protect her from the truth. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant rustling of the trees outside. Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. There had to be more to this than just the journal. The man who had confronted him, the threats, the cryptic words. He was just a pawn in a much larger game. The question was, who was pulling the strings? Who were the ones above the man who had followed them? And what did they want with him? Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from outside. A branch snapped, followed by the sound of footsteps. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the knife at his belt. "Stay down," he whispered to the girl, his voice urgent. He moved quickly to the window, peering out into the darkness. The figure he had seen earlier, the man who had followed them, was back. This time, he was not alone. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with a heavy coat and a face that Jake didn't recognize. They were both armed, their steps deliberate as they approached the cabin. Jake's heart raced. They had found them. They weren't safe anymore. He turned back to the girl, his mind working quickly. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice low. "Now." He grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her toward the back door. They didn't have much time. Jake glanced one last time through the window. The two men were almost to the door. Jake's mind raced. There was no way out of this cabin without being caught. Unless. He pushed open the back door and stepped into the dark woods. "Keep up," he said, his voice low and steady. The girl followed closely behind him, her small feet moving quickly to keep up. The cold air stung Jake's skin as they ran through the forest, the sound of pursuit growing closer behind them. But this time, Jake didn't look back. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. They couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. The cold night air cut through the trees as Jake and the girl sprinted through the woods, the sound of pursuit growing steadily closer. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could hear the men crashing through the underbrush behind them, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. They were getting closer, much closer. He didn't know how long they could keep running. The girl's breathing was heavy, but she kept pace, her small hand gripping his tightly. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. She was trusting him to protect her, to keep her safe, and he wasn't about to let her down. They had to get out of the forest, away from the men who were closing in on them. Jake's mind raced as he scanned their surroundings. He needed a plan, and he needed one fast. He glanced to the side and saw a steep ridge up ahead, covered with thick trees and rocks. It was their only chance. He didn't give the girl any warning. With a sharp pull, he guided her toward the ridge, pushing forward as the ground began to rise. "Keep up," Jake said, his voice firm but urgent. The girl nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. She was scared, but she trusted him. That trust was all he had right now. They reached the base of the ridge, and Jake didn't waste any time. He scrambled up the rocks, pulling the girl along with him. The terrain was rough, but they couldn't afford to stop. The sounds of their pursuers were getting louder, and Jake knew that if they were caught, there would be no escaping the consequences. He reached the top first, then turned to help the girl climb up. She was struggling, but she made it to the top with Jake's assistance. They paused for a moment, catching their breath, and Jake looked down at the path they had come from. The men were almost at the base of the ridge, but they hadn't seen them yet. They were still hidden, but Jake knew it wouldn't be long before they would be exposed. "We have to keep going," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. He didn't give the girl a chance to respond before he started moving again. The ridge stretched on ahead, narrow and treacherous, but it was their best shot. They moved carefully, the ground unstable beneath their feet. Every step was calculated, every move deliberate. The cold wind whipped through the trees, making it hard to hear anything other than the rush of air and their own footsteps. But Jake's instincts told him that the danger wasn't over. They had to get to safety, and fast. They walked for what felt like hours, the ridge twisting and turning, the darkness of the forest pressing in on them from all sides. But no matter how far they went, the feeling of being watched never left Jake. It was like a presence, a constant reminder that they weren't safe. The girl, her hand still tightly clutched in Jake's, said nothing. She hadn't spoken since they started their climb. Jake glanced at her, but her face was set, her eyes focused straight ahead. He could see the weariness in her expression, the exhaustion from running for so long. But there was something else in her eyes, something stronger than fear. She was more than just scared. She was determined. And so was Jake. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the end of the ridge. They were out of sight of their pursuers, but Jake knew they weren't safe yet. The woods still stretched ahead, and the danger wasn't over. But at least they had a moment to breathe. He turned to the girl, crouching down to her level. "We have to move quickly. Stay close to me, all right?" The girl nodded, her small frame tense, but her eyes resolute. Jake didn't wait for another word. He turned and started walking again, his mind still racing, calculating their next steps. They needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere they could plan their next move. But the longer they stayed in the woods, the more dangerous it became. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of branches snapping behind them. He spun around, his hand going instinctively to the knife at his belt. His heart raced as he looked into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He didn't wait to find out if it was the men following them or something worse. He grabbed the girl's hand again and started running. They sprinted through the trees, the sound of their breath the only thing they could hear. Every step was a struggle, the ground uneven, the trees blocking their way. But Jake was determined. They were going to get out of this. They had to. As they ran, Jake's mind raced. The journal, the men, the warnings, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but there was still so much missing. He needed to know what the men were after, why they were chasing him, and how deep this went. But there was no time for answers. Not yet. They had to survive first. As they approached the edge of the woods, Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, something like a whisper carried by the wind. He froze, his body tensing. The sound was coming from the trees, from behind them. He turned to the girl, his face hard. "Stay down," he whispered urgently. They ducked behind a large tree, trying to stay hidden. Jake's heart thudded in his chest as he waited for whatever was out there to show itself. He had no idea what was following them, but he couldn't let it find them. Not now. Not when they were so close to safety. They crouched behind the large tree, both of them frozen, listening for any sign of movement in the dense forest. The air was thick with tension, the quiet only broken by the soft rustle of leaves and the faintest sounds of the woods around them. Jake's heart raced as he strained his ears, every sense alert, waiting for something, anything to give away their position. He glanced at the girl, her wide eyes full of fear but filled with trust as well. She clung to him, her small hand gripping his sleeve tightly. Jake had promised to keep her safe, and that promise weighed heavily on him now. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Jake knew they were being watched, but by who? He squinted into the darkness, searching for any movement, any sign that they were no longer alone. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder as they neared. Jake's body tensed, his instincts telling him they were closing in on them. It was only a matter of time before the men would find them. He had to think fast. The last thing they needed was to be surrounded in this thick forest with nowhere to run. He looked at the girl and whispered, "Stay low. Don't make a sound." She nodded, her face pale with fear, but she didn't say a word. Jake pulled her closer, pressing her down behind the trunk of the tree. The footsteps were closer now, right on top of them. Jake's grip tightened on his knife. He wasn't sure how many men were after them, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let them take the girl. He couldn't let them take the journal. The footsteps came to a halt, and Jake held his breath. There was silence for a moment, and then a voice broke through the quiet, low and dangerous. "I know you're out there, Morrison. It's only a matter of time." Jake's stomach turned. The voice sent a chill through his body, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He had to stay hidden. The man's voice echoed again, this time a little louder. "You can't outrun us. You never could." The words were like a knife in Jake's chest, stirring up memories he had long buried. He hadn't run from the life he had left behind, not until now. And now, it seemed like that life had come back to haunt him. The man's footsteps moved off in another direction, and for a brief moment, Jake thought they had been missed. But then he heard the crunch of twigs underfoot, closer this time, and the figure reappeared, standing just a few feet away from the tree. Jake cursed silently under his breath, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had to make a decision. Should he wait and hope they wouldn't find them, or should he act now and fight? His hand tightened on the knife, but just as he was about to make a move, a familiar voice called out, distant but unmistakable. "Jake, it's me. Don't do anything stupid." Jake froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He recognized the voice. It was someone from his past, someone he thought was long gone. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jake hissed under his breath. He could barely make out the figure that stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat. His face was obscured by shadows, but Jake knew him well. It was Ethan, a man from Jake's old life, someone he had once trusted. Ethan's eyes scanned the area, and he lowered his voice as he stepped closer. "I'm not here to hurt you," Ethan said, his voice gruff but calm. "But you need to listen to me. They're not going to stop coming for you. They'll find you, no matter where you go." Jake's mind raced. Ethan was one of the few people from his past who knew the truth about what had happened, the truth about the betrayal that had changed everything. But Jake wasn't sure if he could trust him now. "Why should I believe you?" Jake growled. "You disappeared without a trace. You think I'm just going to follow you blindly?" Ethan didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his eyes hard but filled with a warning. "Because you don't have a choice. They're after the journal. and they'll do anything to get it. Jake felt a cold chill settle in his chest at the mention of the journal. He had suspected as much. The journal wasn't just a piece of his past. It was the key to something far more dangerous. He had no idea what was in it, but he knew it was important, and now he was beginning to realize just how far people were willing to go to get it. What do you know about it? Jake asked, his voice sharp. Ethan's eyes flicked to the girl behind Jake, who was still crouched low, her face hidden by the shadows. It's not just about you, Ethan said. It's about everyone you care about. They'll use them to get to you, to get to the journal. You need to trust me if you want to survive. Jake stared at him, his mind racing. He didn't want to trust anyone, especially not someone from his past. But he had no choice. The stakes were too high. Where do we go? Jake asked finally, his voice low. Ethan nodded and motioned for them to follow him. I know a place, he said. A safe house. It's the only place you'll be safe for now. But we need to move fast. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed the girl's hand and turned toward Ethan, knowing they had no time to waste. The past was catching up to them, and there was no escape. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this mess. They moved quickly through the woods, the night air thick with tension. Jake kept his hand firmly around the girl's wrist, his eyes scanning every shadow, every rustle of the trees. Ethan was a few steps ahead, moving with purpose, though Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He didn't trust the man, he couldn't. But for the first time in days, Jake had a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way out of this mess. Maybe Ethan was right. They needed to get to the safe house, wherever that was. The girl stumbled slightly, her exhaustion starting to show, but she didn't say anything. Jake glanced down at her, her small hand still tightly gripping his, and for a moment, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The journal, the men hunting them, the dangerous secrets that had come to light. He had dragged this little girl into a nightmare, and now he had to make sure they both made it out alive. Ethan turned, noticing the girl's struggle. We're almost there, he said, his voice firm. Jake nodded but didn't respond. He didn't know what Ethan was planning, but it didn't matter. The stakes were too high now. As they continued through the forest, the trees began to thin out, and the sounds of the night faded into an eerie silence. Jake could see a faint light in the distance, the glow of a cabin, small but welcoming. They were close, but as they neared the cabin, Jake's instincts flared. Something was off. The air felt wrong, too still. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Ethan reached the cabin first, pushing open the door with a quiet creak. He motioned for Jake and the girl to follow. This is it, Ethan said, stepping inside. Jake hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the forest. The silence was suffocating. No footsteps. No movement. He didn't trust it. Jake, the girl whispered, pulling gently at his sleeve. He turned to her, his expression softening despite the weight of everything on his shoulders. We're safe here, right? She asked quietly. Her voice held a hint of fear, but also hope. She trusted him, and that made the burden even heavier. We're safe for now, Jake replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. He nodded toward the cabin. Let's go. They stepped inside, the door closing softly behind them. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a simple interior, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a small stove in the corner. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but at least it was a place to catch their breath. Jake glanced around, his senses still on high alert. The walls were bare, the room cold and uninviting, but it was a temporary haven. You've done well, Ethan said, his voice carrying a note of approval. Jake turned to him sharply, his eyes narrowing. What's your game, Ethan? He asked, his voice low but firm. Ethan's face remained neutral, his expression unreadable. My game? I'm trying to help you, he said, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. They won't stop coming for you, Jake. You've seen it for yourself. You can't outrun them. Jake took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He needed answers, but he wasn't about to give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. I don't know what you're involved in, but I'm not trusting you until I have a damn good reason, Jake said, his voice cold. You should have trusted me from the start, Ethan replied, his tone suddenly hard. This isn't just about you anymore. It's bigger than that. Jake felt the tension rise in the room. Ethan was playing a dangerous game, and Jake wasn't sure he wanted to be part of it. But the situation was out of his control now. The men were still out there, and they were getting closer. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the girl, who was now sitting quietly at the table, looking around the room with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She doesn't understand what's at stake, Ethan said, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. But you do. The journal, everything, it's all connected to something much larger. Something neither of us can escape. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine at the mention of the journal. It wasn't just a relic from his past. It was a key to something that could destroy everything he had ever known. And the men chasing them weren't the only threat. Ethan's words echoed in his mind, sending a chill through his veins. They couldn't outrun this. Not anymore. Jake turned to Ethan, his jaw clenched in determination. What's really going on here? He demanded. What do you know that I don't? Ethan sighed, his eyes darkening. It's not just about the journal, Jake. It's about what's inside it. The people after you, after her, are part of something much bigger than a simple treasure hunt. They want control, power, and the journal is the key to it all. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Control, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Ethan replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But there's more to it. The journal is a map, Jake. It's a guide to something much more dangerous than you could ever imagine. And they'll kill anyone who stands in their way to get it. Jake's stomach churned. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. But he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back. He had to protect the girl. He had to protect himself. But how? Ethan's gaze met Jake's, and for a moment, there was something almost pleading in his eyes. We need to stick together if we're going to survive this, Ethan said, his voice soft but urgent. Jake's mind raced. Survival. That was the only thing that mattered now. All right, Jake said finally, his voice steady. But if you're lying to me, I swear I'll make you regret it. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. You won't regret it. But we need to move fast. The clock is ticking. Jake glanced at the girl, who was now watching them closely, her face full of questions. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he couldn't answer her. Not yet. He turned back to Ethan. Let's move then. The cabin was quiet, but the air was thick with anticipation. Jake paced back and forth, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything. Ethan stood near the window, his eyes scanning the surroundings, while the girl sat at the table, her small hands clasped tightly together, her face pale with worry. Jake could feel the weight of the journal in his jacket, a constant reminder of the dangerous path they were now on. Ethan had made it clear that there was no escaping this, but Jake wasn't ready to accept that. He wasn't ready to give up the fight. We need to move, Jake said, breaking the silence. Ethan turned from the window and looked at him, his expression serious. You're not ready yet, he said, his voice low. We can't just run blindly. They'll be looking for us, and we need to plan. Jake's jaw tightened. He knew Ethan was right, but he wasn't willing to wait any longer. How much longer? Jake asked, his voice sharp. How long do we sit here and hide while they come for us? Ethan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake could see the flash of something behind his eyes. It's not just about hiding, Ethan replied. You're not just running from them. You're running from something much bigger than you realize. And I'm not sure you're ready to face it. Jake's heart raced, a cold sweat creeping down the back of his neck. He had a feeling Ethan was about to reveal something that he wasn't ready to hear. What do you mean? Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped closer. The journal, Jake. It's not just some old relic from your past. It's a map to something dangerous, something they've been searching for a long time. Jake's mind reeled. What are you talking about? He demanded. What's so dangerous about it? Ethan shook his head, his expression dark. I don't even know all the details. But I know that whoever is after it wants more than just information. They want control. They want power. Jake felt a chill run through him. Control over what? He asked. Ethan hesitated, then looked Jake in the eye. Over everything. Over the world. This isn't just some treasure hunt, Jake. This is about something that could change the course of history. And you're in the middle of it. Jake stood there, his mind spinning. The weight of Ethan's words hit him like a freight train. He had thought he was just dealing with a group of people who wanted the journal for some personal gain. But this was different. This was something much bigger, something that could affect everyone. Why me? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why do they want me? Why do they want this journal so badly? Ethan sighed. Because you're the key, he said quietly. The journal holds the answers to something they've been searching for, and you're the only one who can give it to them, whether you want to or not. Jake's heart stopped. What answers? He whispered. Ethan shook his head, his eyes shadowed with regret. I don't know. I wish I did. But I know one thing for sure. They'll stop at nothing to get it. And if you don't help them, they'll destroy everything in their path to make you. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Jake felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had always known that the journal was important, but he never imagined it could be this significant. What do we do now? Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Ethan's expression softened slightly, but there was no warmth in it. We have to keep moving, he said. We can't stay here any longer. They'll find us. And when they do, it'll be too late. Jake nodded, his mind racing with questions, but he didn't have the luxury of time. He had to move. They had to move. He looked at the girl, who had been silent the entire time, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Are you ready? Jake asked her, his voice soft. She nodded slowly, though she still didn't fully understand what was happening. But she trusted him. That was enough for now. Let's go, Jake said, standing up and moving toward the door. Ethan opened it, and they stepped out into the night. The air was cold, but Jake barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed with the weight of what he had just learned. The world was bigger than he had ever imagined, and he was a part of something much more dangerous than he had ever realized. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't about to give up now. He had to protect the girl. He had to protect the journal, and he would do whatever it took to keep them both safe. They moved swiftly through the woods, the silence around them suffocating. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Jake kept a tight grip on the girl's hand, never looking back. They had to keep moving. The world was closing in around them, and Jake wasn't sure how much longer they could stay ahead of the people who were hunting them. But he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The forest stretched endlessly in front of them, the shadows of the trees shifting under the moonlight. Jake moved quickly, the girl's small hand still gripped tightly in his. Ethan a few steps ahead, always on alert. The cold night air bit at his skin, but it was the fear in his chest that kept him on edge, the gnawing feeling that their enemies were closing in. Every step felt like it might be their last. Jake's mind raced. The journal, the secrets, the betrayal, it was all coming to a head. He had never imagined that something so simple, so personal, would turn into this tangled web of danger and lies. But now, there was no way out. There was no turning back. How much further? Jake asked, his voice strained as he glanced at Ethan. We're almost there, Ethan replied, not turning around. His voice was low, but Jake could hear the urgency in it. They needed to move faster. The sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush in the distance made Jake's heart race. They were being hunted. He could hear them now, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the dirt, the unmistakable thud of men on their trail. Jake's grip on the girl's hand tightened. Keep going, he urged, his voice low but firm. The girl, exhausted but determined, nodded, her steps quickening to match his. But Jake could feel the weight of the chase pressing down on them. The air felt thicker, the silence between their steps louder, and the fear of being caught. It clung to him like a second skin. They reached the edge of the forest and found themselves standing. At the base of a rocky hill, the cabin in the distance barely visible in the moonlight. The safe house, as Ethan had called it, was still miles away, but it was their only chance. We need to make it to that cabin, Ethan said, his voice urgent. Jake nodded. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion and fear, but she didn't ask questions. She knew that time was running out. We're not stopping, Jake said, more to himself than anyone else. He turned and started to climb the hill, pulling the girl along with him. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to. The sound of the footsteps was growing louder. They were closing in. As they neared the top of the hill, Jake risked a glance behind them. A flash of movement in the distance. Two figures emerging from the forest, their silhouettes barely visible against the darkened backdrop. The men were coming for them, faster than Jake had hoped. He had no choice but to keep going. The hill crested, and Jake found himself standing at the top, looking down at the cabin below. It was their last hope, but getting there would be the hardest part. The men were close. We have to run, Jake said, his voice low and urgent. Without waiting for a response, he took off, the girl following close behind, her breath heavy and ragged. They made their way down the steep incline, the ground beneath them uneven, rocks and loose dirt threatening to trip them up. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't stop. Not now. Not when they were this close. The cabin was getting closer, the light from the windows offering a beacon in the darkness. But the footsteps behind them were getting closer too. The sound of heavy boots on the ground, the unmistakable crunch of leaves. Jake could hear them, feel them closing in. He pushed himself harder, the girl's hand slipping slightly in his, but he didn't let go. They were almost there. Almost safe. Just a little further. As they neared the cabin, the door opened, and Ethan stepped out. He was waiting for them, his expression hard. "Hurry," he shouted, motioning for them to come inside. Jake and the girl reached the door in seconds, and Jake shoved it open, the three of them stumbling inside. The door slammed, shut behind them with a loud bang, the sound of the men's pursuit now muffled outside. Jake leaned against the door, panting for breath, his heart still racing. The girl was out of breath, her small body trembling in exhaustion, but she was safe. They were safe. For now. Ethan turned to face them, his expression serious. "That was too close," he said, his voice tight. "But we're not out of danger yet." Jake nodded, still trying to catch his breath. "What now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Now, we plan," Ethan replied. "We need to figure out where the journal is taking us. We don't have much time." Jake ran a hand through his hair, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The journal, the secrets, the chase, it was all coming to a head, and he had no idea what to expect next. The girl stood next to him, her small hand gripping his jacket again, the fear still evident in her eyes. Jake looked down at her, his heart aching for her. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve any of this. But she was with him now, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. He was in this to the end. No matter what it took. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice steady. "We'll get through this." Ethan met his gaze, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. "I hope you're right, Jake. Because the truth is, we're in this together now." Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of the situation was enough. The past had caught up to him, and there was no running anymore. It was time to face it head on. And whatever happened next, Jake knew one thing. He was going to fight for the girl. He was going to fight for the journal. And he was going to fight until the very end. Get ready for an intense ride through the world of Hell Angels stories. As secrets unfold, a former Hell Angels member named Jake is forced to confront his dark past when a mysterious journal surfaces, leading him and a young girl into a dangerous pursuit by deadly forces. As the men behind the journal close in, Jake must make impossible decisions to protect those he loves. With danger lurking at every corner, Hell Angels stories unfold with unexpected twists and turns. Through betrayals and secrets, the true power of the journal is revealed, and Jake's survival hinges on his ability to navigate a web of deceit and ruthless enemies. In this thrilling journey, every step brings him closer to the truth, but also deeper into a deadly game where allies may not always be who they seem. The stakes are high, and with each passing moment, the line between friend and foe blurs in this high-stakes adventure filled with the raw emotions and high-octane action typical of Hell Angels stories. Will Jake be able to protect the journal and the girl, or will the dark forces surrounding him prove too powerful to escape? Hell Angels stories continue to captivate with the raw intensity of loyalty, betrayal, and survival, and in the end, the price for uncovering the truth may be more than Jake can handle.